Okay, so good morning, friends. It's a pleasure to be back again on this Sunday. And today our guest speaker is Mr. Javier Rodriguez. And Javier is going to talk to us on the way of negation and examination of the core of the teachings. Javier needs no introduction in this group because he has spoken before this group earlier. But for those of us who are joining for the first time, I'll briefly introduce Javier. Javier comes originally from Spain. In his mid-teens, he came across the work of Krishnaji and was instantly struck by its wholeness and ring of truth. From 1975 to 1978, Javier was a student at Brackwood Park School, the school Krishnaji founded in England in 1969. After completing his BA in Humanities and MA in Spanish language and literature from United States, Javier returned to Brackwood as a teacher in 1990. There he met up with Krishnaji's close collaborator, Dr. David Bohm, and actively engaged with him in the exploration of let us dialogue proposals. Javier also spent 2 years from 1993 to 95 as a resident scholar at the Krishnamurti Foundation India headquarters in Vasant Vihar, Chennai. On his return to Spain, he conducted a K-inspired inquiry group, translated several of Krishnaji's books into Spanish, and became a trustee of the Latin American Foundation, the Krishnamurti Foundation responsible for disseminating his work in the Spanish-speaking world. Javier also joined Krishnamurti Link International, an informal group of former Brackwood staff members brought together by the German industrialist Mr. Friedrich Grohe, who was Krishnaji's close friend during the last 3-4 years of his life and a lifelong financial supporter of Krishnaji's institutions worldwide. Javier was one of the main editors of KLI magazine, The Link, which served as an international forum for the study of Krishnamurti's teachings. In the year 2000, Javier moved to the Netherlands, where he has been residing ever since. He has been collaborating with the Dutch K Committee and continues to be associated with KLI. He edits Frederick's newsletter and is active in KLI's international network of activities. In 2016, Javier started giving a course offering a comprehensive introduction to K's life and teachings. The idea for this course stems from his sense that there are universal in nature and a potential avenue of significant insight and fundamental change. As such, he feels they deserve the closest study as well as widest dissemination, for they are a veritable education for mankind. Last, I think, 2 years, Javier is offering an introductory course on Krishnamurti's life and his teachings, which is an online course. Some of us are aware of that. With this brief introduction, before I ask Javier to start his talk, I want to thank him profusely on behalf of the Case Study Circle Indore for accepting our request and being with us today, in spite of his very busy schedule with his courses and other programs. So thank you so much, Javier, for being with us today. Thank you. You can begin your talk now.
All right. Thanks a lot. Well, thank you, actually, for the invitation. It's always a real joy to be with you and be able to share in this way. I'm always very grateful to KFI for the generosity that they had with me in letting me stay at Vasanta Vihar for nearly 2 years. And it was one of the most joyful and creative periods of my life. So I have a great love for India and for all the culture that it stands for. So I'm actually grateful to be able to communicate with you, share with you in this. So today we have this topic of looking at the core of the teachings, and particularly from the perspective of Krishnamurti's way of negation. That's how I put it, and partly because that's how he ends that statement, and because it is actually one of the core approaches that he takes to the whole spiritual quest. He goes by the way of negation. It's not unique to him. The mystics generally have used this way, the way of negation. Even in Christianity, which has tended to be more on the positive theological side, the mystics have also gone the way of negation, because they knew that there was something there that could not be posited or encompassed by thought. So they had to negate what it wasn't in order to arrive at what is. This is what Krishnamurti always maintained. You come to the positive by way of negation. But we look at this particularly in relation to this key statement of Krishnamurti's, the core of the teachings, which he made in 1980. His biographer, Mary Lutjens, English biographer, Mary Lutjens, was writing the second volume of her biography, The Years of Fulfillment, and she had written a statement trying to summarize Krishnamurti's teachings in her own way. And she had made something of a statement to the effect that this was the core of Krishnamurti's teachings, and she sent it to him for confirmation. He scrapped the whole thing, according to her own report, and only left the word core in the title. So this is what we have, is actually from him directly, and it's a unique statement in that he seldom tried to summarize his work. How could you summarize something so infinite? In fact, it is the only one text that I know that we have of his directly, in which he tries to do this. In many ways, towards the end of his life, he was making all kinds of summaries, like the talks he gave in Washington, I think in 1980 or something like that. Washington, D.C., took talks, he summarized his teachings beautifully. The talks in Sri Lanka in 1980, especially, I recommend, because there, in the second talk in particular, which was published separately as the Book of Life, he goes through his own teachings, really, gives a summary of them as a reading of the Book of Mankind. That is a beautiful, beautiful talk, which I think is just about the best, even better summary than the core of the teachings. But the core of the teachings is very concise. And Krishnamurti tries to draw the essence of what he had to say. By the way, there are at least two versions of this statement. So I'm going to use the one that I took from the website, official website of the Krishnamurti Foundations. But there is another statement which appears in Mary Lutjens's biography, which is actually the original one that Krishnamurti wrote, and it's a bit different. I think they added certain things to this one and took certain things out. I don't know if somebody is going to make a third statement combining them both, but I think the key elements remain pretty much the same. So I'll start by reading the whole thing, and then we'll go through it, bearing in mind this negative or negation, the approach of negation that Krishnamurti takes to the whole psychological, spiritual inquiry. So here we have the statement as drawn from the official websites of Krishnamurti websites, foundation websites. The core of Krishnamurti's teaching is contained in the statement he made in 1929, when he said, "Truth is a pathless land. Man cannot come to it through any organization, through any creed, through any dogma, priest, or ritual, not through any philosophical knowledge or psychological technique. He has to find it through the mirror of relationship, through the understanding of the contents of his own mind, through observation, and not through intellectual analysis or introspective dissection. Man has built in himself images as a fence of security, religious, political, personal. These manifest as symbols, ideas, beliefs. The burden of these images dominates man's thinking, his relationships, and his daily life. These images are the causes of our problems, for they divide man from man. His perception of life is shaped by the concepts already established in his mind. The content of his consciousness is his entire existence. The individual is the name, the form, and superficial culture he acquires from tradition and environment. The uniqueness of man does not lie in the superficial, but in complete freedom from the content of his consciousness, which is common to all humanity. So he is not an individual. Freedom is not a reaction. Freedom is not choice. It is man's pretense that because he has choice, he is free. Freedom is pure observation without direction, without fear of punishment and reward. Freedom is without motive. Freedom is not at the end of the evolution of man, but lies in the first step of his existence. In observation, one begins to discover the lack of freedom. Freedom is found in the choiceless awareness of our daily existence and activity. Thought is time. Thought is born of experience and knowledge, which are inseparable from time and the past. Time is the psychological enemy of man. Our action is based on knowledge and therefore time. So man is always a slave to the past. Thought is ever limited, and so we live in constant conflict and struggle. There is no psychological evolution. When man becomes aware of the movement of his own thoughts, he will see the division between the thinker and thought, the observer and the observed, the experiencer and the experience. He will discover that this division is an illusion. Then only is there pure observation, which is insight, without any shadow of the past or of time. This timeless insight brings about a deep, radical mutation in the mind. Total negation is the essence of the positive. When there is negation of all those things that thought has brought about psychologically, only then is there love, which is compassion and intelligence. That's the full statement. It's just about 1 page long. It's not very long, but look at it, it's dynamite. Potentially explosive, blowing up the human consciousness as we know it. And he starts from truth is a pathless land and ends in negation, total negation as the essence of the positive, because from that negation of the content of consciousness, compassion and intelligence, according to him, if there is that quality of total insight, arise. So let's go through it a little bit, see if this makes sense. And the challenges that he poses, of course, above all, which I think are quite enormous. Curiously enough, this was written in 1980. He refers back to 1929, when he dissolved the Order of the Star in the East, and refers to his statement, truth is a pathless land, as being really the core of the teachings So the core is already there. The essence for him is in that statement. The core of Krishnamurti's teaching is contained in the statement he made in 1929 when he said, "Truth is a pathless land." That was revolutionary right there and then. It actually was perhaps the major factor in his deviating, if you like, from the whole theosophical program, because then he says man cannot come through it through any organization. So he denies organization in relation to the search for truth. So he's denying, you see, truth is a pathless land. He's denying means to truth. So he starts negating. He's not starting positing truth, but he says there is no way to it. So already the negation is radical right from the beginning. You can't come to it through any organization, through any creed, through any dogma, priest, or ritual. That is specifically, of course, refers to the whole religious dimension as we have it, what he used to call organized religion. He felt that that was not the way to truth. He's talking, again, also about religious truth, if you like, the truth that religion has been pointing to, not scientific truth, not whether the atom moves around, the electrons move around the nucleus and how much is there in the nucleus, or what's happening in the subatomic level, or relativity, if the light bends around the sun. Nothing of that. He's talking about something far more essential, which has been the field of religion. Religion has been concerned with truth in its most essential way. Truth as the ground of goodness. Truth as the essence of wisdom, not as the key to accurate objective knowledge. It contains that knowledge. He always said that the religious mind contains the scientific mind, but goes beyond it. The religious mind, without consideration for facts, would be could be deluded. So it has to take account of facts. And Krishnamurti will go through facts, but the facts he's pointing to are illusory facts, are facts that are made up by us. And that's why the negation becomes so critical and important, because essentially human consciousness, as he sees it, is operating on a delusional basis, on a self-contradictory mode, and therefore falling from wholeness and not able, therefore, to contact truth, which is the essence of wholeness itself, of goodness. So there is something to that in the very exposition that he makes, in my opinion, is quite logical, as we will see. But it's also very challenging because it how you say, goes at the core, takes almost the core out of what we consider to be the essence of our consciousness and the very ground of our life as we know it. So that will be the challenge. So let's go back. Man cannot come to it through any organization. So religion, organized religion, as far as he's concerned, is out as a way to truth, not through philosophical knowledge. So even that, maybe we could speculate, nothing like that, or psychological technique. I'm not sure that the psychologists have ever tried to come to truth, though they have tried to clear up consciousness to maybe see in a deeper way. He has to find it through the mirror of relationship. So it's not like truth cannot be found. It can be found, and there is a particular place that he points to us where truth is to be found. So that's already important, because he says there's no way to truth. You could just sort of imagine that it's in there in empty space, in the vacuum of the universe, and you just have to wait for it to come to you, and you cannot do anything. You cannot look for it. You can't pay attention to anything. But he says it's to be found. It's to be found, meaning it is there, right? It is there. Where is it? In relationship. I'm not sure we think that about relationship that way. That relationship is where truth is to be found. Otherwise, maybe we would pay much more attention to our relationships. We look at the way they are. They're a bit of a mess. generally speaking, not just personal relationships, but institutional relationships, international relationships. All these relationships are, people are at loggerheads. But if truth is to be found there, if relationship is the domain of truth, then we might give it much more importance, much more attention. Yeah. Now, how is it to be found? He says, through the understanding also. It's not just relationship, through the mirror of relationship. Relationship is only a mirror. And what does it reflect? The contents of one's mind. So that's what he always said. If you want to understand yourself, you have to see yourself. And where do you see yourself? In relationship. Because there's where you manifest. Your kindness, your aggression, your desires, your fears, your pleasures, all that comes into play. Right? The one's arrogance, vanity, and so on. All of that comes into play, and that's what one can see. So actually, what he's pointing to is what he always pointed to, that the way of truth is the way of self-knowledge. You have to understand yourself before anything beyond yourself is to emerge. That is not self. Right? He has to find it through the mirror of relationship, through the understanding of the contents of his own mind, which is what relationship reveals, through observation. So we had to learn to see, and not through intellectual analysis, though that may play a part, not necessarily as analysis, but as questioning. We also have to develop the art of questioning, right? Or introspective dissection. In a way, he's always took issue with analysis. That's what the psychologists in the West, more or less, Western psychology started that way, by psychoanalysis, right? Freud and company, they started looking at how people developed certain pathological conditions that could not explain physically. So they had psychosomatic origins. So they started talking to people and seeing how the consciousness itself was bringing those effects about. Sometimes, for example, people were paralyzed in their bodies or part of their bodies, but there has no organic cause. So it had to have a psychological cause. And as they started looking and analyzing dreams, for example, they had to, because the dream was expressing in very confused ways, in a language that the conscious mind didn't understand, what actually was behind the whole phenomenon of what was happening to that person that was bringing this pathological condition about. So it was to recover the repressed content of consciousness that constituted the cure. Right? That was their assumption, and that worked in many cases. But that required analysis, required questioning, looking into and probing into and understanding even the language. It was a different language that consciousness, the unconscious, was speaking. So analysis became a tremendous thing in the Western world at the time, from 1910 or so, 1900s, when Freud began the whole thing. So that exploded in the Western world, but that had its own limitations. So Krishnamurti was not going to go that way, even though he continuously questioned all his life, right? And in fact, as students at Brockwood, he was very demanding that we think through these things. So he wasn't denying thinking altogether and his analytical capacity or questioning capacity, but the analysis ultimately does not really come to truth. It's not complete. It's ever missing something. So he puts the emphasis on observation. And as you will see, we'll see a little later, on particularly this choiceless awareness that he's talking about, which creates the ground of insight. Insight is what liberates. And insight is not an analytical process. It's an actual perception. So this is the beginning. So no path to truth, but truth is still to be found. There's a space in the mirror of relationship which reveals the contents of one's mind. And one has to see that through observation. What are the contents of one's mind? So then next he goes into that, which is very interesting. So what are this content of the consciousness? He says, man has built images in himself as a fence of security. So this consciousness, the content of consciousness, is made up of these images, right? So is that what we see in the mirror of relationship? That we have images about ourselves, about others, and we relate from there. That's a very simple observation on Krishnamurti's part, right? Pointing to us saying, watch it. The watcher and the watched are just images. That's what he leads him to. The observer is the observed, partly, right? There's that deeper meaning to that statement, but partly is that we work with images. That is the content of consciousness, has built images in itself as a fence of security. So it's not just images for the sake of images, but it has a purpose. These images are intended to provide security. Religious, do they provide security? If one believes in something, one feels secure in one's belief, right? And in fact, life is so uncertain, one is going to die. This is a very small little passage of our existence, is the blink of an eye in the infinity of the universe. So one has to have some meaning. So maybe a belief gives us some meaning and a certain security. One doesn't have to be afraid anymore because there's an explanation as to what gives meaning to one's life, what is one's place in the universe. Nice, if we can do that. But is it true? Political, the same. You can see what's happening. Everybody has an image concerning their nationality, their position in society, their political inclination, if they are socialists, communists, capitalists, or just playing the game. Personal, also, that one has one's image of oneself, what one thinks one is, what one's beliefs are, all that is also images. So he says these are images and they're aimed at security. But watch it, there comes the irony. These images manifest as symbols, ideas, and beliefs. Sure, all kinds of symbols. A nation somehow cannot exist without a symbol. Symbol is a beautiful word. It comes from Greek. That's an English word derived from the Greek language on the western side of the Indo-European family of languages, which means symbolane, means to throw together. What do you throw together? You throw a sign and a meaning. Like the Indian flag has a wheel in the center. That wheel stands for the whole Hindu tradition, doesn't it? And the lion and so on. All those are symbols. The English have a horse, a unicorn and a lion. See, they all have symbols. Everybody has a coat of arms in the Western world. The church, the Christians have a cross to signify their thing. Symbols. There's an object, a sign that has a meaning. When the meaning and the sign fall apart, like they did in communism, the hammer and the sickle fell apart because the meaning of the whole organization wasn't working anymore, right? So then it goes apart. It's no longer thrown together, it's thrown apart, loses its meaning, the symbol loses its meaning. So symbols, beliefs, ideas. This is how the religious and political and personal world function, right? The burden of these images, he calls it a burden, because it's a content of consciousness, dominates man's thinking. Well, that's how we think. We think in terms of images, right? And relationships in daily life. They dominate relationships. I don't think we are very aware, in general, that we operate and relate through images. But you can see that, right? If I really believe that I'm a Hindu and somebody is a Muslim, well, you are more in that situation than we are here in the West, but that is a very well-known phenomenon worldwide. It's not just that you live that personally, but it's being lived by the whole world. Every conflict is lived by the whole world, and it's due to those images, to those concepts, right? But of course, closer to home, we have the problems in relationship. At home, intimate relationship, man and woman, right? You have an image of what you want, of what you are. She has an image of what she aspires to, what she is. And those images don't necessarily match. Everybody has their own ambition as to how they're going to fulfill, right? I'm going to fulfill by going ahead and climbing the social ladder. And the other says, no, I'm going to seek the spiritual path. Well, then the division has already arisen. You don't fit into each other's scheme of things. So relationship can suffer enormously from these divisions that the images bring about, even though the image, as we saw, is intended to provide security. And that's the problem. These images are the causes of our problems, for they divide human beings from each other. Wait, there you have the contradiction. Krishnamurti is very good at showing contradiction, exposing the flaw in our way of thinking. We intend security, so we put our eggs in that basket of the images and the identifications, the symbols, the beliefs, and the ideas. And then it turns out that those things divide us, which creates conflict and undermines, destroys security. So there's a contradiction already inbuilt in the whole thing. That's why negation, once one sees the truth of that, negation is inevitable. Negation not as a verbal thing, because we have also done that philosophically. We have negated through reaction, right? But he says it's a negation of the false. The perception of the false would end it. And part of perceiving the false, beyond just the logic of it, is to see that it contradicts, something contradicts itself. That what I intend is actually what I get from the end of my intention is exactly the opposite. This is what happens. According to Kay, and we should test it in our own existence, that when we lean on images as defenses of security in the religious, political, and personal fields, in the whole of our existence, we end up in a contradiction, so that we end up in conflict at home and abroad. So that those images have to be questioned at least and seen through as the danger that they are. They do not provide security. They provide, in fact, the causes and sources of conflict. He says his perception of life is shaped by the concepts already established in his mind, which is our worldview, how we see things. But that is already also an image, right? The content of consciousness is his entire existence. Wait. You see, that's a big statement, right? That we somehow do think that consciousness maybe is just a part, but actually we live in it. We're lived by it. We live through it, right? I think in the Dhammapada, the Buddhist primary, prime book for monks, I think the first verse says something like to the effect that our thoughts of yesterday make our life of today. Our thoughts of today make our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. Now, I didn't think Buddhism needs to go any further. Just stay with that. That is sort of the statement here too, partly. That's how I understand it. It is that the mind dominates our existence. Maybe not entirely, but it's a dominant factor in our existence. Consciousness, the content of consciousness, not just consciousness, may have other meanings, deeper meanings. The content of his consciousness is his entire existence. In this version of the core of the teachings, there is a sentence that's missing, in my opinion, if I dare to go that far as a scholar, which is that basically Krishnamurti's basic statement that consciousness is his content. Now, this has caused, I had some discussions with friends of mine just lately. Said, what does he mean? Because when I try to be conscious of anything, I don't see any content. So, well, yes, the content is these images. Okay? So that, he says, is dominating our entire existence. They control our lives. The thoughts of yesterday make our life of today. The thoughts of today make our life of tomorrow. It's a continuous stream from the past through the present to the future. This is the bondage of time that Krishnamurti constantly points out. Right? The individual, he goes into the individual, because consciousness has that notion that you and I are individuals, separate entities. But what is an individual, so-called as we know it? The individual is the name, the form, and superficial culture he acquires from tradition and environment. So yes, look, on our screens, there are different names. So that identifies us, right? Even there's pictures in some cases, or the actual living image. So that also identifies. So that's the form, right? And then we have the form superficial culture. So is culture superficial? That he acquires from tradition and environment. So each of us has been shaped. Is the shape, the content of consciousness, what we have acquired by being born in a particular place, even from a particular race, particular culture. But he says that's superficial. Why is that superficial? You see, we have put our values there, the guidance for our existence, what we are live by, right? We have drawn certain, it's tradition. Tradition has taught us. Hinduism, probably for most of you, Christianity for me. So there's a whole current that has come through into my consciousness, has shaped me even as a kid, conditioned me probably in ways that I may not be fully aware, right? But he says that's superficial. So the individual remains a superficial entity, so-called, right? Because it's just the subject of these influences. What is essential to it? We consider that maybe culture might be something essential, but maybe it is not. Maybe there's something deeper. And therefore, because we are the result of these collective influences, he says we're not unique. We're just the product of something. We're not original. We're not in touch with something that has its own source, let's say in truth, in something truly creative and unique. So we're not unique, even though we think we are, right? Now we are unique in certain ways, right? Maybe our shapes are quite different, right? And in fact, our fingerprints are unique. Our DNA are unique. That's why the police can catch us if we do something wrong, you see. They can identify us very specifically if they have that information in their database and they find our fingerprint on the crime scene, then they can just go to the database and catch us. Good. I am all for justice. But you see, so there is something elements of uniqueness. But overall, Krishnamurti says, this is not creative. This is still a mixture. Each of us is made up of a mixture of all these collective elements, and he has his peculiarities, what you call idiosyncratic elements for each of us, right? But we are the result. We're still within the bounds of what is common. Right? The uniqueness of man does not lie in the superficial, which is what he has been describing, this name, form, and superficial content of culture, but in complete freedom from the content of his consciousness. Wait a minute. You see, we have leaned on the identification with the content of consciousness to define what each of us is. Our being is defined, as we know it now, by the very content of consciousness with which we are identified. That's me. Right? But he says that's not you, in the sense of the uniqueness of being does not belong to this domain of the content of consciousness, which are all these images. So what is it? He says this consciousness with its content is common to mankind. Wait a minute. We just said, the peculiarities to me, and I draw it from somewhere else, but the consciousness is still the framework, the collective conditioning, the deeper structures. When Krishnamurti talks about consciousness is common to humanity, what does he talk about? He talks about the fact that all of us suffer, that all of us are lonely, that all of us are fearful, that all of us are seeking security, are violent, and so on and so forth. The commonality of consciousness doesn't lie in the fact that I was brought up as Christian and you as Hindu, or whatever else, right? That I lean to the left and you lean to the right or to the middle, that one is a nationalist and the other is not a nationalist, etc., etc. The one has a pink color and the other has brown and the other has blue. So it doesn't, none of that really makes a difference when it comes to this essential understanding of what consciousness is. Consciousness and its content. We're talking about a consciousness that's still a content, right? Not something that is empty. That would be a different kind of consciousness. So the content of its consciousness, which is common to all humanity. What is common to all of us? We're all functioning from memory, We're all functioning from thought. We're all functioning from becoming. This he called the content of consciousness. It's a very interesting text of Case in one of these early talks, in which he talks about the layers of consciousness. And he says there is a superficial layer, which is this thought going on in our minds on an everyday basis. And he says below that there is memory. That's what it functions on, and that's what also is required for action. And he says below that, so there is superficial memory, and below that, he says, there is the will to become. How that arises, I don't know. There are very mysterious elements happening. But there's a will to become, which is what seems to move through memory and the superficial layers of consciousness to our own action in the world. It's the world of becoming. So that is the content of consciousness. But he says then, he said, below that, there is nothing. That is still the whole of consciousness. So consciousness is not necessarily its content. It's the emptiness in which that content is. But at the moment, it is the content that dominates. And therefore, the wholeness of consciousness does not come through. Consciousness may be an emptiness or require emptiness for its wholeness to be. And that's why he goes at the content. And the fundamental issue of denial he's bringing here, across here, because we're talking about the way of denial, the way of negation, is that this content is actually preventing this wholeness from coming through. So is there, therefore, an emptying of that content of consciousness, which is how he defined meditation. Meditation is the emptying of consciousness of its content. Right? So he says at the end, concludes, so he's not an individual. He's not an individual because he's divided by the images. They fragment us, they divide us. And not only that, but the content of that consciousness, divided as it is still common. So it's not unique. Neither you nor I are unique in that we're still functioning according to the structures of consciousness that have been developed over time in the history of humanity. We're all still functioning differently in variations, modifications, different combinations, permutations of that content, but it's still bound and is still limited. So he says that is not an individual, either way, because it's fragmented internally and because it's common. So what is an individual? So he talks about freedom. You can see that the content of consciousness is already beginning to describe it as something that is confining, right? The limiting and creating its own contradictions, particularly from the level of images and security, as well as from the separateness of one individual from another. So he says freedom is not what is for his freedom. This whole search of religion, of humanity, as being for liberation. We call it liberation, right? This moksha, this freedom, that which would bring about a completely different state of mind, wholeness, right? In which truth is the active principle of our lives and not this conditioned movement of the content of consciousness. But what is freedom? He says it's not a reaction. Well, we've known freedom as a reaction in the sense, for example, of political oppression. Therefore, we want freedom, then we react. We go and start a revolution. Freedom is not choice. That is a tough one for most people, right? For most, especially in the Western world, we have taken it as a kind of sacred, it's a sacred cow for us. It's a sacred slogan, you say, that freedom is choice. In fact, I heard it from my own daughter when she was just 3 years old. You can see how powerful the collective consciousness is. My little daughter said, I was trying to tell her, look, please don't do this or do that, right? Like what parents do, sometimes maybe unnecessarily. She said, and she said, don't tell me that. I am free. And freedom is to do what I want. 3 years old. That was remarkable, with a total conviction. And I said, who might be speaking, right? And I realized partly what's speaking is the collective consciousness. which is already coming through this child, has already absorbed something so tremendous and fundamental, that freedom is to do what you want, what you like, your own choice. Freedom is choice. Why is freedom not choice? So he says, this man pretends that because he has choice, he's free. Wait, we haven't yet discovered why it is a pretense. No? Freedom is pure observation without direction, without fear of punishment and reward. Wait, he hasn't yet explained it. Why is freedom not choice? Now, partly it is choice, right? That I can go to the right or to the left. When I walk in the woods, I can go forward or backwards. I can turn around, I can leave this place and go to another place. I can choose this philosophy, that philosophy. But he still feels that those are, in a way, reactions, partialities. Freedom and wholeness would go together, so that as long as we are choosing, we are not dealing with the facts. There's a partiality to it, and freedom is not choice in that regard. He further clarifies it a little bit by saying that freedom is not, well, let's see, freedom is pure observation. So if I choose, this was part of his issue, right? With our way of approaching life generally, that when we look at things, we do so with already a preconception. That preconception, a motive, he also talks about motive, you see, without direction, without fear of punishment and reward, freedom is without motive. So we have a motive. The motive may be, I want to find this out so that I can get something from it. So we're not, seldom anyway, observing purely. The observer brings in a motive. We want something. We have a reason. We have an end in view, or just a reaction. So he says that is not freedom. Freedom is pure observation without direction. Can you observe without direction? Without motive. And then he puts in a tremendous sentence. Freedom is not at the end of the evolution of man, but lies in the first step of his existence. I know that the whole Hindu Buddhist conception is that there is an evolution. And in the West, we have a bit of a vaguer notion of that, which is life after life, we will improve until finally we are free from all those glitches, the selfish motives, the narrowness of our minds, that which brings about conflict and suffering, generation after generation. Karma and reincarnation will take care of it. That's part of evolution, right? Psychologically, spiritually speaking, right? And we also have, generally, humanity has a faith that evolution actually is a process whereby humanity will ultimately, how you say, overcome its own limitations, its own narrowness, and achieve its full potential. It's inbuilt in the West as well, though we haven't formulated it so clearly, right? So Krishnamurti says, no. Now that breaks down one of our great hopes. You see, I don't have much hope that in this life I might be completely liberated. So I would love to have another life when I can come back and do something about it. See, finish what I started. Finish the project of the self. But you see, Krishnamurti says basically the self has to end for that wholeness to be. So you'll never go into complete the self. That's part of why the evolution is meant to be the evolution of the self. But the self does not really evolve. We modify things here and there, but the self is not to evolve because it's always implicitly limited by being rooted in the content of consciousness, which is time-bound. It will never overcome itself. Is that true? But he says also, freedom is not at the end of the evolution of man, so let's hold that. But lies in the first step of his existence. Wait, what is the first step of our existence? Is it when we were born? Now, when we took that little step, Were we free? Well, it was a difficult step to begin with because we couldn't even walk right there and then, right? But what's the first step of existence? The first step of existence is now, was always now. So it's not later. It's not in a way in time. Now, that is a tremendous suggestion, right? That actually the total freedom of man, humanity, lies in this moment. You can't lean on time in order for that freedom to come about, on evolution. Is that true? That freedom, therefore, is a timeless perception, moment to moment, of life as it is. He's offering a completely different view of eternity, good or okay, and of freedom, therefore. What is liberation? What is the ending of this everlasting grind of consciousness that goes from life to life? Consciousness does reincarnate, because my consciousness is reproducing the consciousness of all my ancestors and of all humanity. I am a reincarnation in that regard, and so are we all. As long as we remain within the field of consciousness, and that is where we live from and are lived by, then we are reincarnations. But Kay was always talking about incarnate now. That's a very different point of view. Beautiful, but not so easy. Easily said, and I can say it even in words, without deeply understanding the full implications of it, because time is still dominant, right? But that's his suggestion. Well, no, his absolute statement. Freedom is not at the end of the evolution of man, but lies in the first step of his existence. As you know, the first step is the last. There's no next, like the Zen Buddhists say. Freedom is found in the choiceless awareness. So freedom can be found. That's also good. See, he said, truth, there's no path to truth. There's no path to freedom, therefore, but it can be found in the choiceless awareness of our daily existence and activity. The choiceless means also that we don't bring that past with its own motivations, which is the continuity of that past from into the future. You see, our thoughts of yesterday make our life of today. Our thoughts of today make our life of tomorrow. That is the choice that's going on daily, right? And that creates the chain of time. This is karma. The chain of time that is created by consciousness as it interferes with observation. So he says, if you can live without that choice in observation, then the chain is broken. That's what he suggests. And that is freedom. But there we had to meet the enemy. We have an enemy in the house at home. And that is thought, time, and self. So he says, thought is time. Now, even that would take some insight, some looking into, to be fully aware of what the implications of that is, the actuality of it. Because, he says, thought is born of experience and knowledge, memory, which are inseparable from time and the past. Well, knowledge is memory, is the past itself, psychologically speaking, right? Time has other meanings. But psychologically speaking, time and the past, memory, is the root of thought, the ground of thought. Without it, thought cannot function. Even though thought is not absolutely determined by memory, it can respond to intelligence. So let's not condemn the poor thing to the dustbin of history. It is still an important aspect of being human. I don't think we could be human without thinking. But at the same time, we're not fully human without intelligence. And intelligence goes beyond thought. Thought does not contain, has its own intelligence, but intelligence that Krishnamurti talks about as well and mentions, right, is beyond thought, goes beyond it, it's insight. Time is a psychological enemy of man. Why? See, we have an enemy. This is terrible. I mean, most of us have known this for all our lives, that we were our worst enemies because of the contradictions that we carried out in relation to our best intentions. Our best intentions ended up in some other opposite results, which is what he's been describing, is part and parcel of the whole process of consciousness as rooted in images, in motives, and seeking security, which by dividing brings about its own opposites. So time, psychologically, is the enemy of man because it trips us up. We trip ourselves up. It doesn't trip us up. We are time, we are thought, self is thought, and self is time. So time is the enemy because it's destroying us. Sometimes I think I should stop there and contemplate for the next 10,000 years. Though he says time is not of this, forget the 10,000 years. We just said, we look, either you see it or you don't. It's just now. But there you are, the enmity that the very structure of consciousness brings about in us, the self-destructive movement that time and thought represent. So it's not just the war in Ukraine or the continuous struggles between Muslims and Israelis, or Hindus and Muslims, or Chinese and Americans, God knows what else. These are expressions of the structure of consciousness that is its own enemy. So we have to tackle this enemy, which is us, right? This time is destroying us. How does it do it? Partly what we said, right? Because of this image making, this identification with the past, that divides us. And not only divides us from each other, separates us from life, from the very creative movement of life that's going now, where wholeness is to be found. We don't have relationship to begin with. And relationship is life. And relationship is where truth is to be found. There's no separating truth from life. So that is a tremendous thing that he's pointing out, where, that we continuously act, exist, function on the basis of a consciousness that's going against life. You couldn't get a worse enemy than that. So watch it. This is us, right? So we're living with this enemy, which is us. Our actions are based on knowledge and therefore time. So man is always a slave to the past. We're slaves. We have an enemy and we are slaves. That is horrible. See, the slave is somebody who's not free. So in fact, this quality of time is also the denial of the freedom that he has just been talking about. Right? Thought is ever limited because it's rooted in memory. And so we live in constant conflict and struggle. The limitation of thought, why should it mean conflict and struggle? Well, this very limitation, is it the factor of conflict and struggle? You could say, well, it's limited, I don't know anymore, so leave it at that. But it's become absolute because of our identities. The limitation of thought has become our mode of acting. And that partiality does create conflict and misery. See, if I believe that I'm really sincerely in Christianity or something, you see, that creates a separation, a limitation in my being itself, in my relationship to somebody else, and there is conflict. So there is a tremendous truth to that, the limitation of thought as the ground of conflict. So as long as we live there, we will have conflict. And conflict is the denial of wholeness, is the denial of truth, is the denial of freedom. So it's a lot of denial. See, he's trying to deny everything that goes against wholeness. He says it again, there is no psychological evolution. We've been through that. When man becomes aware of the movement of his own thoughts, he will see the division between the thinker and the thought, the observer and the observed, the experiencer and the experience. Now, do we see that much? That's already, do we have to begin there? Do we see, are we so aware of the movement of our own thoughts that we are aware of the division between the thinker and the thought, the observer and the observed, the experiencer and the experience? This is part of the whole operating of consciousness on the basis of image making. I am an image. Am I an image? See, I don't think I'm an image. See, the image doesn't think it's an image. It's a very complicated issue, right? That none of us thinks that himself, that we are just being run by thought and his images. And when I look at somebody else with my image of what I am and what the other is, then I'm projecting what I see. If I project, if our perceptions are projections of an image, then what I see is me. The observer, me, is the observed, because what I see is my own projection. I live in my own self-referential system of thought. Thought has this capacity, which is very peculiar, to split itself into two. So he says, this is me observing. But he doesn't see that the observer contains already an image through which it is observing. So the objectivity, so-called, is lost. Prejudice is a very good example of how that works. If I have a prejudice, that means a conviction concerning something, the nature of something. I look at that something always through that, and I don't see it because it's something that's already from before. The past blinds me to the present. What I see is that past. It's self-referential. So that isolates me from that other, from the other. That isolation is a division that is the source of conflict. So there you have it. In the observer and the observed, you have the movement of thought as this divisive structure, because it has divided that process. It's an illusion. If that is part and parcel, I haven't gone any further than this, but if that is part and parcel of the structure of the self psychologically, then it is indeed illusory, as he says, right? He will discover that this division is an illusion. Do we discover it? Occasionally we have discovered it, right? We have seen that we were projecting and that we were not seeing the other, and therefore that on seeing the projection, that it was just us and not the other, the whole thing collapsed. If I see that the observer is the observed in that regard only, there's deeper meanings to this statement, I'm projecting, then that collapses. When it collapses, I can look, I can see, but only if I see the illusion. But there are deeply rooted convictions in us, deeply established prejudices that we never really see through. And we have to continue. And the main one may be that I am separate from thinking, that the thinker is not the thought, that there is an agency in me that is there independently of thought. That's the tougher one. The observer and the observed is still manageable, but the thinker and thought seems to hide itself much more deeply inwardly. You will discover that this is an illusion. This division is an illusion. Then only is there pure observation, which is in sight, without any shadow of the past or of time. Well, at least there is perception that is not clouded by any previous content of consciousness. So insight can also occur. Insight is perhaps deeper still. Insight means to see into something, directly the truth of something. And we need insight. We need that direct perception. That is the freedom he's talking about. When we in the present stay with the facts, he said the fact has no contradiction. I think that's a tremendous statement to make. The fact has no contradiction. The problem of our lives is that we live in contradiction. Why? Because this is an operation, this projection of our past onto the present, and then things don't add up. We create these divisions through projections, through conceptions, through beliefs, and then things fall apart. So our intent to goodness, our intent to brotherhood and cooperation ends up in conflict, contradiction. But what is the fact? The fact has no contradiction. The fact is this one, that we are deceiving ourselves. We can see through that then we can perceive directly, and there is freedom from that whole movement. That makes sense, but we have to do it. This timeless insight brings about a deep radical mutation in the mind. That's when the insight goes far enough. It's not just an insight into a particular aspect of consciousness, but into consciousness itself. It has to go to the root for that mutation to take place. So it's not just that, I have a little insight and consciousness radically transformed. No, I have to have an insight into the very operation of consciousness and the self-deceptive structures that it has created for itself. Total negation is the essence of the positive. So he goes back, he's been negating. What has he negated? Path to truth. Approaches through organized religious methods, philosophical thinking, and psychological analysis. At the same time, he said, you have to watch it. You can find it in relationship, but there you have to observe, learn to observe. And observation requires this sense of the absence also, negates the observer, because it's all these images and projections. So he's negating. He says, negates the content of consciousness and the motivation behind the content of consciousness with his images, because he seeks security, but it divides. So negates the content of consciousness, negates the separate individual, negates that freedom is choice, negates thought as the fundamental operating system of consciousness of humanity, right? Negates the observer, negates the thinker, negates evolution. What does he not negate? So this is the way of negation. But he says only, you see, the negation, total negation, total. So it's not just partial negation, it's total negation is the essence of the positive. When there is negation, but what is the total negation of what? He says, when there is total negation of all those things that thought has brought about psychologically, which are all these images, concepts, blah, blah, only then is there love, which is compassion and intelligence. That would be the positive, which we're all wanting and seeking, but which this structure of consciousness, the self-delusional structure of consciousness, self-contradictory structure of consciousness. In fact, what he's pointing to is that consciousness as we know it now is caught in its own self-contradiction. If we can have an insight into that self-contradiction of consciousness structurally, then we may have this freedom from which these other qualities of insight, love, intelligence, and compassion may arise. That would be lovely, but so okay, I'll leave it there so we can have a little discussion.
Thank you, Javier. It was a very interesting discourse, starting from the core of the teachings to truth, then to consciousness, freedom, and thought and insight. I think you have covered the whole landscape of Krishnamurti's teachings, and it was very, very interesting. We were spellbound, and just time passed. But we have some questions. We'll start with Dr. Harshad Parekh, and then go to Dinesh Waghmare. Yes, please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Are you able to hear my voice?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dubeyji, and thank you, Javier. Your speech is so clear, so fluent, and you covered the whole thing very beautifully in 1 hour or so. But my question is that if we have just the knowledge of the teachings, a very, very clear understanding, intellectual understanding of the teachings, can it really help? Or what we have to actually do is to go deep within ourselves, be very, very curious to look inside, because what happens that we are using our mind to study many subjects like history, geography, English, and mathematics, and so on. And so in that there is a duality between the observer and the observed. But when we become very curious to look at the mind itself, means how these thoughts are moving, then there is no distinction between the observer and the observed, and it requires the mind to be very, very silent and very curious, looking at the beginning of a thought. And so this is the first step, probably, that we have to uh, look at the beginning of a thought. And when we do it, it requires actually the freedom, energy, curiosity, intensity. All these quality are required. And what happens is that our mind is caught into many, many thoughts and feelings, and it is not coming out from that dimension of thinking and feeling. So only when the first step is taken, when actually this coming out, and when there is no thinking, no feeling, actually just observing whatever, and when that happens, then we really see that, oh, it's so beautiful what Krishnamurti says. But getting all the knowledge, thinking about it, I don't think even if we continue reading without experimenting, without looking at our own inner world in silence, then without that, it we can become very, very clear in all the concepts. We can connect everything with one thing with the other thing, and can give a talk also. But what we need is the gap between two thoughts, and when there is a silence, and then looking clearly. When that happens, life becomes very, very beautiful, very enjoyable. And that is what I found in Krishnamurti teachings, because before that, my mind is just used to go round and round, thinking about the past or the future. But when Krishnamurti said, thought creates the thinker, and then the thinker tries to change thought, and this duality is the source of all our psychological problems. And that sentence in the first book really made me curious to look at the mind itself, the mind looking at itself. And in that, the mind actually stops, and then there is a different state. And then that the first step is taken, then it can go on day after day, like year after year. And maybe later on, there is no need to make any effort to look at the inner world. It becomes like one's nature. Okay, I have said enough thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Javier, would you like to
Hello.
make a comment, or should I go to the next questioner now?
Oh, I think what Dr. Parekh has said is quite clear. I don't think I need to add any comment.
Okay. Yes, Dinesh, please go ahead.
Are you able to listen to me, sir?
Yes,
Mhm.
please.
I am having only two questions. Whatever you said is perfectly all right. It is understood. You said that at the base of the consciousness, there is a will to becoming.
What? Oh, yeah.
Will to
Will to
become.
become, yes.
Yeah. But in my views, still there is a lower level, which is your psychological, which psychologist says your traits, psychological traits, your inclinations, your parameters, your instincts and all that. So that's basically makes the individual. From there, when the energy surges are coming out, then only further they convert into the observer and all that. So what you have to say, how to tackle this individuality of your psychological traits, parameters, inclination, etc. Number one. Number two, you said, as you said rightly, that there we are full of images and all that, and that images can we can know only in the relationship. So if we have to empty our mind, then we have to go into relationship, and then only we will come to know about ourselves. And this is also a time-consuming process. So it is not indicating rightly it is not means it will also take time, uh, which we cannot say how much time it will take. And third thing is, he is talking about energy. One should have the energy to go beyond this and all that. So what sort of energy is talking about? These three are the points. Thank you.
Let me see. My mind is not working very well this morning, so I may have trouble remembering your 3 points. So the first point was what? Relating to the will to become and the individual, right? That arises, the individual gives rise to the individual. Was it something like that?
No, beyond even the below will to become. Basically, the individual has what makes your individuality. Individuality is made by your psychological parameters, traits, and all that.
Right.
Okay. You have explained that. Yeah.
Yes. No, good. Thank you for reminding me. I lost track. The individual is not coming from below. That's one of the suggestions that Krishnamurti was making. The individual is coming from that whole movement of the will to become that operates through memory and then moves thought in order to achieve whatever becoming implies. How that arises, I do not know. To me, it's a mystery how within the field of consciousness, which in principle is empty, it's just an awareness, how this movement arose. You see, I think Kay himself had some difficulties explaining it. He just basically said, well, that intelligence split into two, and the energy, as a matter of fact, that you were talking about in your third question, which is, and then maybe we can mix the three questions together: the energy, the intelligence, the arising of the individuality, and the whole issue of images. See, Krishnamurti says there's one energy, the original energy that brought about this whole manifest world, which is itself timeless, but somehow it expressed itself, gave rise to matter, to thought, to life. So life itself, because of its survival motivation, thought channeled itself, the quality of energy, of intelligence, which belongs to energy is intelligence, channeled itself into survival. See? That's one explanation. I think it's incomplete. I think there must be something more to it. But never mind, this is as far as I got it. Okay? And the word is not the thing. Energy is split into two, so intelligence. So that one energy went into survival. This energy of survival became thought in order to generate the necessary security. So security became the fundamental purpose of this aspect, stream of intelligence, of energy. And that, however, because of its concern with security, as we just explained, or tried to explain, mind you, became self-contradictory. So it went away from intelligence. The question is that then it developed individuality, because the individuality is actually a way of identifying the particular entity that must survive. It identified with the body first, because that's the biological ground of survival. And then, because psychologically thought was so important for the survival of the organism, it conceived of its own immortality, of its own necessary continuity as the way of survival. See? So that's one explanation. And that's how the individuality came about, how all these contradictions developed within the movement of thought, and how the energy also got split. Because the creative energy from the source, which is where Krishnamurti wants to bring us, as a matter of fact, look what his teachings are a way of, one way of looking at them is as a dismantling of the dualities that were created along the way in the evolution of humanity. One duality he starts with is individual and society, that we have a common consciousness. So he denies that division. Denial, negation, negates that division, then moves into consciousness and negates the division of the thinker and the thought. That is to restore sanity, because all these things are insane. They are all leading to conflict, and they're fundamentally illusory. They may have particular functions. I still have to find my food. You see, you are not going to give it to me. So I'm going to go to find it, you see. So, all right, this organism will have to do his job, like an ant going and finding a piece of grain for the winter. That's what we have to do. So there's a part of individuality and collectivity that's necessary. But inwardly, you see, there is no such thing. He wants us to bring back to reconnect thought with intelligence. Thought has come from the same source as energy, but it has split and gone into a contradictory mode that has made it unintelligent. So to restore intelligence and wholeness in this whole flowing movement requires the undoing of these contradictions, so that thought and intelligence also merge. Tough one, because mostly the thought somehow keeps referring to the past. In order for thought to be intelligent, it has to respond to intelligence, and therefore not always be rooted in memory, even though it may have to use memory, for example, as language, in order to express that intelligence in the world. That is the beauty of the wholeness Krishnamurti is pointing to. And that means the negation of those divisions, of the individuality, of the will to become. That's why he goes into it systematically. The teachings, the core of the teachings, as he has expressed them, have that intent. And that's why he works so hard on getting us to understand this content of consciousness that has got trapped in his own self-contradictory movement. Not sure I'm answering your questions, because those questions cannot be answered just verbally, right? We have to pay attention, though, to just how, because you talked about relationship as well, and how that's a mirror, which we can learn about ourselves, and that takes time. So it's another task, another job. Well, our life is what we got. So it's not like, you see, if you bring time in, that's what Kay said, right? If you bring time in already, then you just already get a bit, you feel that it's an effort. You instantly feel that you have to do something, and that you have to pay attention, and that you have to understand yourself. Well, isn't that sort of merely the suggestion that because it is in daily life, it is in relationship, where it all plays out, where our conditioning manifests, where these conflicts take place, where the evidence of our lack of intelligence is to be found. So this is the way of negation. What we see is actually the absence of intelligence. What we see is conflict, is the expression of our conditioned way of operating. But it requires attention, not an effort, just the fact that our life itself, because it's so dangerous, because we live with the enemy in the house, in our own skin. Look, if you have an enemy, you have to do something. It's not like you can just sit there and let the enemy do whatever it needs to do. You got to do something. What do you need to do? Be very aware, very awake. What are they doing? Meaning, what am I doing? What is the self doing? That is just the primary necessity of liberation. So it's not an effort, it's a necessity. Something that actually, an urgency. If we have an urgency, if we were to see the actual tremendous urgency of the situation, that we are destroying ourselves and each other, that's simple, huh? By the way we are operating, then that attention would be there immediately. No time, no effort.
Thank you, Javier. I think our time is already up, but I'll take one more question, and for others, I'll request, please, you can write to Javier, giving your comments or questions, whatever, and he'll respond to it. So I'll just take Dr. Pradeep Verma's question and close. Yes, Verma, please unmute yourself.
Am I audible, Javier?
Yes.
Am I audible? Yeah. What I enjoyed most was your almost perennial smile while explaining the contradictions in words. That gave me a message that one can be free. Absolutely, you are free from these so-called contradictory words and self-oriented, time-bound, and past and present everything. So that shows a freedom you are enjoying, and so am I. A few innocent questions I have. First, because you will later on tell me that I don't remember a second time. First, I'll say, what triggered the fragmentation of the whole into negative and positive? Is it positive? Is it positive for the individual or the whole? And what is supposed to be negated has some relevance and utility in our daily life.
So would you mind repeating the first question?
First question is, what triggered the fragmentation of the whole into negative and positive? Is it positive for the individual or for the whole? That was the first question.
I think we can take the first question only, and for the rest, Dr. Verma can write too. Yeah.
Well, how did things split into positive and negative? Right. What is the negative? Right. Normally, we take the negative, that which goes against our interests. Right. It's almost the bad. Right. So there was an old story about what is the good and what is the bad. What's the positive and the negative? That's the way we now more or less use it, because we seek a kind of neutral terms, because we're moving away from religious terminology. But essentially it means the same. What is good for you, what's not good for you. But it's still the self-determining, right? But there is objective, destructive factors. Right? That the duality that has emerged is itself destructive. The division between the positive and the negative, in a way, our language can't help but go that way. So it's partly linguistic and partly cultural, that we're doing it that way. Now, there has been, I think what we're pointing to, and this is maybe the deeper issue, there has been some kind of contradiction that has arisen in the regard to the manifestation of life and its relationship to intelligence. That's what we're pointing out. We maybe should look into that quite more deeply, because that's at the heart of our problem, right? As human beings. Namely, what we were trying to describe in terms of this evolution, thought, becoming entangled with survival, and developing structures which really are contrary to its intent, which means it's not intelligent. So the loss of intelligence, how did that occur? If this description is correct, some other people have other descriptions. I don't think the evolutionary biologists would agree with this, that there was an energy, there was intelligence, and no, that all happens sort of more randomly and so on. There are different ways of looking at it, but this is how we're looking at it, that there is an energy of intelligence that's still operating, timeless and whole in itself, from which we lost contact because one of its branches, thought, has developed its own self-contradictory movement and therefore become unintelligent. This is what we're talking about. This is the division. That's where the positive and the negative emerged in terms of the self-contradictory movement of thought. That's one way I have of looking at it, you see. Therefore, thought itself, in its unintelligent way, developed contradiction. And the contradiction is the good and the bad, the positive and the negative within it, right? That's why negation is very important in terms of seeing. What Krishnamurti means by negation, really, in the end, is to see the false. And as the false is seen, and this is what he's describing, he's saying this is false. This structure the thought has developed of seeking security through the image, developing a separate entity from the collective, whereas it is the same, seeking freedom in choice and motivation, then basing its whole existence and becoming on the movement of thought and the separation of the observer and the observed, is all false. That's a big I mean, we're all false then. My God, mankind down the tubes. Now, completely self-delusory creation of the universe. But there is where it's developed, I think. So actually what he means, in my opinion, is to bring about a quality of being in which perception is so immediate that there is no positive or negative. There is just what is. Now that would be holistic, that would be freedom, liberation, and all the rest. Nice description. But we have to go through that contradiction. We have to perceive it. We have to see what is false in this whole movement of consciousness before those dualities dissolve. And we are beyond those two, the positive and the negative, which is what we have within consciousness, right?
Thank you. Thank you, Javier. I think we would need perhaps another session to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I want to apologize. I didn't really realize how long I had talked.
No problem.
I meant to keep it to 45 minutes, but in the end, I went an hour.
No problem. I think it was very interesting.
All
Thank
right.
you. Thanks a lot. Maybe we'll get you another time to answer these questions.
Sure. That would be lovely. That would be lovely. We can have just an open dialogue like that. That would be lovely.
Yes.
Okay,
Right.
I'll be happy to do it. All right.
Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, all
for
of
being
you.
with us. Thank you.
Namaste.
Bye. Namaste.
Thank you, Dubey ji. Thanks to every participant. Please end Modak.